Welcome everyone to this session of the University of Calgary's webinar series where we address the day-to-day challenges of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm Deborah Yedlin, your moderator for today, and I'm also Chancellor of the University of Calgary. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back, and to all our new viewers, thank you for joining us. Now, like everyone else, we've had to adjust to a new reality at the University of Calgary. We've moved our classes and operations online while doing our best to support our students and protect their academic experience. We're also reaching out to our communities to offer our information and expertise and to connect those in need with those who can help. We're here to support our community through this unprecedented challenge that is having an impact on every one of us. And one of the ways we can do that is by sharing the knowledge of our scholars who are experts in their fields. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Lianne Tomfohr-Madsen, a registered psychologist, about mindfulness and self-compassion. Before we get to today's presentation, I'd like to remind our community that mental health supports continue to be available. For students, support can be accessed through student wellness services. For after-hours support or if you're in crisis, Woods Homes Community Support or the Distress Center are available. For faculty, staff, and postdoctoral scholars, supports are available through staff wellness. Additionally, Homewood Health is available and provides 24/7 mental health and crisis support. For our community outside of campus, there are many resources available as well. The City of Calgary has shared resources available for emotional support, and you can call 211 for a free helpline that connects you with the resources in your area. We will share those links to the full website in our follow-up email after the webinar. Phone numbers and access to these supports can be found on your screen right now, and they will also be sent to you as in our follow-up email. We know this is a difficult time, and we want to ensure that everyone has access to the supports they need in order to help get them through what they're facing on an individual and collective basis. As I said earlier, joining us today to discuss ways we can support ourselves through self-compassion and mindfulness is Dr. Tomfohr-Madsen. She will kick us off with a presentation and then answer questions from the audience. If you have a question during the webinar, please submit by using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And if you have to leave early, don't worry. We will have the webinar available on demand and we will email you a link when it's online. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tomfohr-Madsen. She's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and an adjunct professor in the Department of Pediatrics here at the University of Calgary. Her research areas include risk and resilience factors for the development of mental and physical health problems, especially during the transition to parenthood. She has a long history of practicing and researching contemplative practices such as mindfulness and self-compassion. Welcome, Dr. Tomfohr-Madsen.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me today to talk about this. Just want to make sure I've got my slides. Here we go. So I'm going to talk to you today about mindfulness and self-compassion. One of the best parts about teaching mindfulness is that you get to connect with a community of people who are interested in mindfulness and interested in being compassionate. And I just want to start today's talk by allowing us all to connect with the fact that there are a couple hundred people here today, and there are people who put this seminar together who are all interested in practicing this, and we're all interested in compassion. And although we can't see each other right now, we really are here holding this space. And so I'd like you to just take a minute and just connect with that. You're really in a space of a lot of care, and we'll hold this space for the next hour. So I want to start by talking about what is mindfulness. As a person who's been teaching mindfulness for about 10 years, one of the most common things that people tell me when they learn that I'm a mindfulness teacher is, I tried meditation and I can't do it. I'm bad at it. I can't focus on my breath, and so I just quit trying. And I always think back to the very first 10-day silent retreat I did, because I was there with these very prolific teachers, and we were all in this beautiful meditation hall, and they said, probably on the first day, they told a story about a person who had come to their center and who was a master meditator, and he would come every day and he would sit in the middle of the hall and he would sit perfectly without moving. He He was clearly very good at focusing on his breath. And then one day somebody came into the hall and they put their mat down where his mat normally was. And when he came in and he saw them, he screamed at them and he picked up their mat and he threw it. And so actually being able to focus on your breath is not that useful a skill. If that's something that you think you have to be doing to be practicing mindfulness, you can let it go. What we're going to be talking about today is the specific facets of mindfulness. And one of them is observing your present moment experiences. That's often what we think about when we think about being mindful. Am I aware of my breath? Am I aware of what I'm doing? And certainly that's important to have, but it's not everything. What you need on top of that is to be able to couple it with this skill of non-judgment of what you find in your present moment experiences. So if you are walking around really noticing your experience, but being very critical of yourself as you notice, oh, my experience today is anxious, my experience today is grief, and then you would put some judgment on top of that. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling judged, I shouldn't be feeling grief, I shouldn't be feeling anxious. Then you're just acting neurotic, right? You're not being particularly mindful. Or if you're very reactive, you notice that you're feeling frustrated because you get to Safeway and now there's these new protocols and they are frustrating, and then you yell at somebody. That's not particularly helpful. What we really want as we're becoming mindfulness practitioners or using mindfulness to help us get through the COVID experience is to notice what's going on, then take this sort of stance of non-judgment and non-reactivity, and then choose a mindful action that goes at the end. One of the reasons that we want to cultivate these facets of mindfulness, this observing, non-judgment, non-reactivity, being aware, is because it seems to make us happier. People who are more mindful report less feelings of depression. They report being less anxious, less stressed. One thing that came up repeatedly as we were prepping the webinar is people were saying that they were sleeping really poorly. Well, the more that people are mindful, the more they're self-compassionate, the better they sleep. But this observing facet is tricky. So if you're really observant, that isn't actually necessarily very good for you. If you're really observant, but you are really low on non-reactivity, so you're observant, but you're reactive, that's actually associated with greater immune system dysfunction, more substance use, more depression and anxiety, more sleep problems. So if all you're going to do is learn to focus on your breath, I would say skip it. What we really want to do is focus on our breath, focus on observing what's around us, and then focus on being non-judgmental and non-reactive to what we find. But that's a tall order, right? Depending on how you grew up, depending on the culture that you live in, you might have been told that you shouldn't have the feelings that you have. You might have been fed a lot of messages like, don't cry, even though you're sad. The one that comes to my mind, especially for men, is don't act like a girl if you're scared. And these messages are really harmful because they force us to go kind of underground with our feelings. They don't let us have the full expression of our feelings. And one of the things that we know in psychology is that what you resist persists. So if you say, I'm not going to feel anxious, immediately you're going to feel more anxious. Maybe you can do something in the short term that lets you sort of get away from your anxiety, but long term, that's going to build up. It's going to sort of come tapping at the door. It's going to say, I need you to acknowledge me. It's sort of this debt that we have to pay at some point. And to really illustrate that, I have just a brief exercise. And so I have a little fire truck here on the screen. This is from a brand of toy that we like in our house. And so I'm going to time for 15 seconds. And I'm going to ask you, just for that 15 seconds, all you have to do is not think about the fire truck, okay? Just don't think about it. So I'm starting now. You're 5 seconds in. A couple more to go. Okay, that was 15 seconds. Normally you do it for 60, but we're on a time limit in this webinar. So how was that experience for people? Did folks think about the fire truck? Generally what people say to me is all they can think about is the fire truck.
And that's, there's somebody just said, of course I did. And then someone else said, of course, it's impossible.
Yeah.
I actually compartmentalized it. I looked at the fire truck and I had that image, but I was thinking about something else.
Yeah. And, you know, we hear that sometimes, like from people, that they'll say, oh, I was spending a lot of time not thinking about the fire truck, but then you're spending a lot of time not thinking about the fire truck,
Yeah.
you know, putting it aside. And it's just really, really, I'm seeing people's comments. I'm still thinking about the fire truck. I'll take it off soon, I promise. It's really, really hard to not think about things that are on our mind. And it's really, really hard to not acknowledge our grief or not acknowledge our anxiety as we're feeling it. And I think right now we're all feeling a lot of feelings. We're all kind of in this together, this new sort of strange situation. And so this idea that we can be observing of our feelings, we can be observing of our surroundings, and we can also be non-reactive and non-judgmental. This is a tall order, right? I've spent a lot of time practicing meditation. I think I went to my first yoga class when I was 13 and really was hooked. So it's been about 25 years of trying to practice these things. And the first 20 years, I just muscled through it. I thought, okay, I'm going to sit in my pain. I'm just going to sit in it. And I've been very good at persisting through difficult situations, but probably to the point like that sometimes they're not good for me. And then in the past couple of years, 5 years ago, I went on a retreat with Dr. Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, and I learned what self-compassion was. And I, no joke, did no other contemplative practice for 2 years afterwards. Just every single day I got up and I practiced being compassionate to myself. Because for me, it wasn't a skill that I really had. It wasn't something I was particularly good at. So what is self-compassion? So first, it's being mindful. Being aware and observing that you suffer and other people suffer. And this is just a universal human truth, and not avoiding that. And then responding to yourself and your own suffering with some care and understanding. This actually involves an active soothing, an active comforting of your distress, which again, many of us have never learned how to do. I think, especially in this culture, we might be encouraged to soothe the distress of other people. We might be very, very compassionate to others and not very self-compassionate. And there's actually research, there's not a big correlation between how compassionate you are to other people and how compassionate you are to yourself. And then this third piece, which I honestly am still wrapping my head around, is this idea of common humanity. So seeing your experience of suffering as part of the larger human experience. And this, I think, is really, really validating and really connecting. So we all experience pain. We all experience sadness. We are all experiencing grief to some extent during this pandemic. And allowing yourself to connect with that and connect with other people really can combat some of the loneliness that's coming along with this experience. So what are the benefits of self-compassion? There's lots of benefits. People who are highly compassionate to themselves report lower stress, anxiety, depression. They're less likely to harm themselves in multiple ways. They're less likely to harm themselves with overwork. They're less likely to harm themselves through substance use, and they're less likely to feel suicidal. They report that they're more satisfied in their lives. They're more socially connected. They're happier in their romantic relationships. They have less burnout, probably because if you are being compassionate, you know that working 65 hours a week isn't good for you. And so you stop. And I think there's a lot of longevity that comes with that. And they report better sleep. And so why aren't we all just doing this, right? Why aren't we all, more positive health behaviors. So why aren't we all just practicing self-compassion? Why aren't we all offering ourselves compassion and kindness and care when we're in pain? I was thinking about prepping for this webinar, and I was feeling a bit anxious, and I was thinking, you know, if a friend was feeling anxious, I would say, oh, I'm so sorry, I think you're going to do so well, you know. But if I'm feeling anxious, my reaction to myself is probably not going to be nearly as kind. If you say something stupid in public and it's genuinely the wrong thing, how often do you say, oh, Lianne, oh, poor thing, that was so embarrassing? Instead, we tend to just berate ourselves. We say things that are so unkind in response. And really, like, if you wrote down what your mental script was in response to your guilt or your shame, sometimes it would be almost shocking for other people to see it. So the reason that a lot of people don't practice is because there's a lot of myths around what self-compassion is. And I think people get worried that if they practice, they're going to be seen as weak. If I offer myself kindness, that means that I wasn't able to muscle through. I needed care. I needed other people. Well, of course we need care and other people. It might make me seem like I'm lazy. I won't be motivated. One of the things we've tried in psychology is tough love. We used to do a lot of it in the substance abuse literature, where we would sort of yell at people to not drink and be unkind to them. And what we know from research is that just makes people drink more. And I want you to imagine that you haven't been exercising for 5 weeks and you tell somebody, oh, I really want to exercise. I wish I was exercising and walking more. I feel terrible. And they said, yeah, you're so awful. You're so awful for not exercising. It's disgusting. It's disgusting the way you don't take care of your body. Just imagine that, how you would feel. It's so unmotivating, right? But in contrast, if somebody said, oh, you really want to exercise, you really want to get walking again. Yeah, okay, I could see that would make you feel better. Okay, yeah, it's hard. It's hard to do that. Let's talk about it. You're going to be so much more motivated. And that's why people who are self-compassionate versus self-critical are much more likely to engage in positive health behaviors. People think that this means that they're narcissistic, right? That if they're being self-compassionate, they are just focused on keeping their view of themselves high, that they're focused on keeping their view of their self-esteem high. But I think we really need to disentangle self-compassion from self-esteem, because self-esteem is this sort of fragile view of yourself that is really dependent on your kind of moment-to-moment accomplishments. It's up if you've done something good and it's down if you've done something bad. But if you're self-compassionate, your worth just isn't based on what you've done. You're probably less narcissistic because you're more connected to this common humanity. And people also think that taking these sort of self-compassion breaks can mean that they're selfish. And certainly that isn't the case, and that's not what we see from research. We see that people who are more self-compassionate are more connected to others. They're better relationship partners. And partially because they're able to stop that observing of this present moment experience, take a break before they're reactive, and then respond in a wise way, respond in a way that's in line with their values. So this is a short, I hope in this short moment convinced you that if you want to practice this, it is not something that's selfish. It's not something that makes you weak. And in fact, it will make you a better relationship partner. It'll make you a better worker, probably a more kind and compassionate person out in society. So if you have a hard time taking these words of kindness for yourself, you can also just say, I'm doing this to become kinder to the people around you. And what if this doesn't come naturally? Well, that would be totally normal. So if you didn't get raised hearing that you should value your own feelings and be kind to yourself, or if the people around you weren't being kind to themselves in response to pain, you've probably not had a really good opportunity to practice. But we know that this is a trait that increases with practice. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, after having done this for about 5 years now, pretty regularly, sometimes my reaction when something small happens even is so much kinder. I was saying to my husband earlier this week, I want to go to yoga this weekend. And then it hit me, okay, there's no yoga, right? And I just had this moment of grief. And I really could have gone 2 ways with that, right? I could have said, okay, but other people have it so much worse and your grief isn't valid. And this is really a stupid thing to be worried about because you have food. I could have just discounted all of my feelings. Or I could have gone the other way, like, oh, I have this grief. I'm never going to be able to get out of it. I'm so sad. But what self-compassion gave me, at least in that moment, was the ability to say, like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, that hurts. That's a place you love, and it's gone right now, and that community is gone. And that little break, I think, allowed me to take a moment and then be able to get on with my day. The other thing that I want to say as we do this, we're just about to go into a practice, is that there's no hierarchy of suffering here, okay? So if you come across your own experience of suffering, but you know that somebody else is suffering more than you, that doesn't mean that you're not worthy of self-compassion. We are too wise in this group to play that comparative suffering game. If you come across difficulty or pain in your own personal experience, then you're worthy of some compassion around that pain. It doesn't matter how little or it doesn't matter how large. And so I'm going to walk us through a really brief exercise. This is an adaptation of the self-compassion break from Dr. Kristen Neff, and there's a link to it at the end of the presentation today. So we're going to start by calling up a little suffering. And we can probably all do that right now. Before we can give ourselves compassion, we have to have a little suffering to work with. So think about a stress or a worry or a relationship problem that you might have right now. Think about something that's difficult for you, but if you're new to self-compassion, something that's not overwhelming. So let's say like a 4 to a 10 on the distress scale. A 4 out of 10, not a 4 to a 10. And then I want you to think about just that situation for a minute. So what does it entail? Are there any feelings that go along with it? Are there any kind of words that you hear? And then I'm going to offer you some words that go along with the 3 components of what self-compassion is. And the first is about mindfulness. So first off, I want you to acknowledge your suffering in this moment. So this is a moment of suffering. And I would really encourage you to use words that speak to you. One of the things that I often do is label the feeling. So this is a feeling of sadness right now. This is a feeling of grief, and just allowing it to be there, just allowing it to be there in your body. And next is just acknowledging that suffering is part of the human experience. So you're not alone in this. There's nothing wrong with your feelings. This is unfortunately, this is part of being human. This is normal. And all of us right now are suffering in some way or another as we get used to this reality. This is part of our life. And then lastly, I'd like you to offer yourself a little kindness and a little care. So you might want to put your hand on your heart if that feels comfortable to you. And you could offer yourself just like a gentle touch. I always like to put my hand on my shoulder. Some people, I see them do this and they're almost giving themselves a hug. But really offering yourself some care and some kindness, and maybe saying some words to yourself like, this is really difficult right now. You're in a period of difficulty. This is really hard. If you can think of something that's comforting to you, I would encourage you to use that language. You might use your name like, oh, Lianne, this is difficult, or maybe offer yourself a wish that this wasn't your experience right now. Oh, darling, I wish you weren't suffering like this. And then just taking a moment to notice, what does it feel like to offer yourself kindness in response to this difficult situation? And then just letting go of that practice and letting yourself be just as you are in this moment. Oh, I missed the waves. I was supposed to have beautiful waves playing for you, but I'll offer myself some compassion for that little mix-up. So after you do this, and I think this is also where people can get a little stuck, is what do I do next? Well, after you've had this moment of compassion, you get to decide what the next right thing is for you. If you're really in touch with how stressed you are, you might decide, I need to take a break. I need to sit down. Or maybe you get in touch with I'm really lonely. I was really lonely. So maybe the next right thing for you is to call a friend. So self-compassion really lets us pause so we can choose what our next right action is. What's your value in this moment? And how can you connect to that value the way that you want to live your life, even in this time of physical distancing? So as I was mentioning, there's a beautiful website, selfcompassion.org. One of the lovely things about the self-compassion people is they're not greedy. Everything that they do is free. As far as I can tell, they record all of their meditations and they put them up online. And they have a nice section on self-compassion and COVID. So if you're looking for some exercises or you want to learn more, I would really encourage you to head there after this talk. Yeah, so that's all for my formal presentation.
Thank you very much for guiding us through that that mindfulness. That practice. I think just having the ability to get in touch with how we're all feeling and give us the space to identify it is very, very powerful right now. One of the questions that's already been posted is how can you thoughtfully encourage and remind others to be compassionate to themselves and to others? It's one thing for yourself to be mindful and self-compassionate, but when you recognize the need in other people, how do you do that in a way that's respectful and constructive and help?
That's $1 million question. Yeah, I know so many people in their lives who need to be more self-compassionate, and I have found no way to motivate them without being really naggy, except to, I think my husband's on this webinar, forcing him to be more self-compassionate. I think that for me, the best thing I can do when I notice that desire to intervene with other people is check in with myself about what's the discomfort here. And so if you're seeing somebody suffer is incredibly difficult, right? Sharon Salzberg, who does a lot of the loving kindness work, has said at this point she can do like 15 minutes of news a day, because at that point her ability to comfort herself is overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So if we're seeing somebody suffer, it's like we have to first acknowledge that that's hard for us, that it hurts to see somebody suffer, and that we don't want them to suffer. And then I think we go at it that way, which is it hurts to see you suffer, and I don't want you to suffer. And is there anything that I can do that would allow you this space? And if they say no, ooh, then you got to acknowledge they said no, because that's tough too. That's really tough too.
One of the things you talked about was sort of being observant and non-reactive. Mm-hmm. Where's that balance? Because we're conditioned to react to what we observe. Yeah. So how do you balance being observant and non-reactive?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult thing to do, and we want to react. We just want to react with some space. So you want to be able to observe what's going on for you and then take a minute to make a wise choice. And so I think this is what mindfulness does for us, is if we're practicing observing our experiences, and this for me is what yoga does for me, and then you stay in a really uncomfortable pose without moving for 5 minutes, then you've developed a bit of muscle memory around, like, don't just jump in and react right away. So what we want to do is observe something, and if it's dangerous, if your fingers are on the stove, like, get them off. But if it's something that's more subtle than that, like you're angry at a friend, or you're having a fight with your daughter, in those situations, I think we really want a minute to decide what our reaction is, so you don't just go right into reactivity and scream at the person. And instead you might be able to say, like, okay, well, how do I skillfully respond to these situations?
Right. One of the questions too is how can we be more self-compassionate when you're surrounded by people who are negative and reactive towards you? I mean, that leads to a cycle of where you're hard on yourself, and it works against that goal of being self-compassionate. How do you sort of build an armor, I guess, and are able to be self-compassionate even in the when you're surrounded by negativity?
I think one of the things that happens as people become more self-compassionate is their tolerance for that goes down. That's really, I think that as we become more aware of our own suffering and we value that we don't need to suffer so much and that we offer ourselves this sincere wish to have less suffering, then we start to do things that put boundaries up. And so often you see people sort of developing this self-care approach, and they will, this is hard to do if you're in an abusive situation, if somebody's being emotionally unkind to you. But one of the things that can happen is you start to have lower tolerance for that. And I think people start to put up boundaries, or they distance from negativity. And, you know, I'm certainly thinking of some clients who I've worked with who, upon starting practices like this, just decided that they could no longer go to their workplaces anymore. You know, that they had to think of a new place to work. They had to be able to do that switch. So I guess the hope is, as we're more compassionate to ourselves, the people around us see that and they sort of take it in. But also, as we're more compassionate to ourselves, we're going to become less tolerant of people being unkind to us. We're going to want to be hurt less.
What if our suffering is regret from years back and there's nothing we can do about it? If we remember it every while, you know, things bubble up. You put things into a box, that box opens, whatever's in that box comes and visits for a while. So you're suffering from things that you might not have done, you know, many years ago, or experiences that you had many years ago. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think the same way. You know, if people have trauma, or, I mean, what you're talking about is like, let's say you did something that you're actually regretful about, you have shame about something. Well, if that comes up for you, I think you acknowledge that, and you acknowledge that that's a difficult emotion and it's maybe trying to tell you something. You know, you can offer yourself some kindness to it, and then you think of what's the next right move. I think about this a lot with people who have trauma, childhood trauma, and they go through treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they get better. You know, they start getting a lot better, and then something happens, like a big stressor, and the stress comes back up again. Well, I think I don't think self-compassion is the cure for everything. I want to be clear about that. I also teach CBT at the university. Sometimes you need to reach out and get professional therapy for these things as well. And that is a compassionate act, reaching out and getting help.
What about if that's you regret something you didn't do? Let's say you were in a situation where you made certain decisions that you're living with today, but that were positive at the time, but you still regret. How do you know, that's part of you, then you're hard on yourself for maybe not taking a different path. Right. I guess it's not that someone harmed you, maybe they did, and you didn't take, you didn't sort of react to that in a way that might have been more constructive for you. Right. So that's another way of looking at it, I guess. What do you do then?
Yeah, like if you're in a life you don't want to be living, or you have regret about the path that you took. Yeah, this is a hard one. I think one of the things, like as you're talking, one of the things that's coming to me is I've done a couple of these 10-day mindfulness meditation retreats, and I remember talking to one of the teachers there at one of them about how I'm such a planner. Like I have planned out every, like, the minutia of my life, right? And I was talking about, okay, well, I'm thinking about in my meditation, I'm thinking about all the plans that I had before and how they brought me here. And then I'm thinking about the plans that I'm going to do afterwards. And I dropped out of university during the first sort of stint with mindfulness that I played with. And okay, what is my decision going to be? And he said, I don't know that you're particularly living in this moment right now, you know? And I said, I'm certainly not. Like, no part of me is in this moment. And he said, I want you to contemplate the impermanence of all things. And this is kind of a deep contemplation, right? That everything rises up and everything passes away. And we really, if we're in touch with that, I think it becomes easier to be focused on, like, what is this present moment actually like? Because everything comes up and everything passes away. And if we're, I've made bad decisions in my life, probably you have. Everybody sort of got this experience of it could have been different. But really what we're left with is this experience that we have right now, which is, for me, very comforting. If I start getting into these sort of past ruminations or worrying about the future, being able to ground into like, what is my actual experience right now today? Because like I'm alive today, it's April 15th, and I get to choose how I'm going to live my life right now. I think that can be sort of the antidote to these sort of regretful feelings, is refocusing on the present and then making a plan for how to live.
And acknowledging that you have a choice.
Yes, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
The question is, for those of us who are not well versed in self-compassion, what are some of the ways to motivate ourselves through self-compassion? So they're giving an example of emotional eating. That's a negative coping mechanism. What kind of recommendations could you have in this context?
Thank you for talking about emotional eating. Thank you. This is like in everybody's mind right now, right? I see it in the news about how we shouldn't be making jokes about the COVID-19. It's hurting people. Everybody I talk to is working in their kitchen, basically. And I was thinking about this so much in the webinar, and I've almost brought it up as an example of how do you use self-compassion to deal with food? Mm-hmm. And so, I have this book, actually, it's called The Self-Compassion Diet, because what the research shows is that if you can be kind to yourself around your food choices, you're actually going to make better food choices. So okay. Let's say right now you're very stressed, right? I feel very stressed. And one of the ways that I cope with stress, at least personally, is I eat chocolate. And so if you're thinking about, okay, I'm probably going to do that. Okay, I'm probably going to do it.
It's a function of quantity.
Yes, exactly. It's a function of quantity. It's a function of whether we got it in the groceries or not, but I'm probably going to do it. So then I get this sort of decision about what I'm going to do in response to that. And one is I could berate myself, right? Yeah. This is probably like 20-year-old me. That's the response. Oh, you shouldn't have eaten that. You're going to be so gross. Your jeans don't even go on anymore. What are you going to be like if you ever go back to the university? And so I think that's one way to go. And I think the other way to go is you were hungry, Yeah. You were hungry in that moment, and food seems dangerous sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it's hard because you need to eat.
Yeah.
And so you might be feeling like, what do we all feel after we eat something we wish we hadn't have? You might be feeling ashamed. Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. So many people are feeling that way right now.
Yeah.
Just I think there was an article in the New York Times, like we are all going through this right now. It is normal to eat in response to stress. It is normal to want to eat fat and sugar in response to stress. And I think if you take that approach in comparison to like, you're so fat, nobody's ever going to love you, that is just going to make you eat more, right?
Yeah.
But if you're kind to yourself, I follow these great normalize normal bodies hashtag on Instagram. And there's this like amazing woman who's been eating a sandwich every day just for Instagram, because she's like, I'm going to eat a sandwich and nobody's going to tell me that that's dangerous. And I just really appreciate that message.
Somebody sent me a link with the CDC in the US saying it's okay to wear a mask in front of the refrigerator. That was funny. There's a question about how you recommend how we de-stress and be self-compassionate, step away from work, and not feel that pressure that we have to do things. When you need a break, you have work you have to do. We all have our coping mechanisms, but the extra stress that everybody's dealing with is causing us to be distracted, and it's hard for us to focus on what we need to really get done. What do you recommend in that regard? Like, how can self-compassion help us deal with what we have to deal with and stop sort of procrastinating and putting extra pressure on ourselves?
Yeah, I think I wish we were all getting the message all of the time that this is not the time to be productive. I know that that's a hard message to get from our employers because of course people want us to continue to work, but I think we have to be acknowledging the fact that we're in this very new reality. And many of us are in it together. Many of us have become all of a sudden elementary school teachers in addition to doing our jobs, which is a really hard job on top of your other job. People are lonely in a way that they haven't been before. We're doing a study of, I study pregnancy. We're doing a study of pregnancy right now, and people are just reporting feeling so lonely and isolated. And I think that these are difficult to reconcile with being the optimal worker.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if the antidote there is just acknowledging that we're going to slow down and reacting kindly. And I hope that our leadership is giving that message. I certainly know in my faculty, we've gotten this message like, now isn't the time to write a book. Take care of yourself so that when we come back, you can write a book. You're not so burned out, you're useless.
Yeah.
But I also don't know how functional guilt is in this capacity. Like, you might have to just give yourself some gentle permission to not be so productive.
Yeah.
So I
and
think
the world isn't going to come to an end if you don't get to it.
No. I mean, some people's world will. There are people right now who are like going to work and hustling so that we all have food. But if you have the space to be able to give yourself a little compassion and a little break, I would say don't feel bad taking that.
So there's a couple questions. I'm going to wrap them into one. It sounds like there's a distinction between self-compassion and condoning past behavior. Can there be self-compassion and regret? And can you also speak to acceptance?
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, certainly self-compassion isn't like a license to do bad things, right? You're not being absolved during this process. So the question is, so what's the difference between self-compassion, so being kind to your own suffering, and then regretting the actions that you had? Is that the question? Yeah.
That's what the question is, yeah.
So I think that they're very separate things. I think that we can have regret for things that we've done, particularly if they have hurt other people, if they've hurt other people or they've had some negative impact, then the appropriate response is to be regretful about that, but the appropriate response isn't to be regretful and paralyzed forever.
Right.
And that is maybe where the acceptance comes in. I did this thing. I'm supposed to feel ashamed. That's literally the function of shame, is to help us do more actions that allow us to be socially integrated. So if you've done something that hurts somebody and you feel ashamed, okay, I have to listen to that. I have to sit with it. It hurts, and then I have to decide what I'm going to do next so that I don't just live in that space. And maybe that's acceptance, is maybe you always, and it goes back to your regret question. Okay, maybe I just have to accept that I regret this.
Yeah. Question about someone says that I'm usually kind, I think, but I find I've lost my compassion filter. Sharp words blurt out recently to a family member and they feel like they've caused so much damage. So they're finding, because they're stressed, that it's hard for them to have self-compassion, to think about how they have to deal with other people close to them. They're saying, thank you for the reminder to be in the moment, but clearly very frustrated that that they reacted in a way that was potentially a little uncalled for in the moment.
Right. I think, first of all, we're all doing that right now.
Not right now. And so I think it's a really valid question or observation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think being in the same sort of four walls with people who you love, even if you love them deeply, I think it can be really, really challenging to not let that stress and frustration come out sometimes. And so, I wonder two things, because certainly this is a webinar about self-compassion. So, if you did it, acknowledge that and give yourself some kindness for it. But then I think also several people have said like, yeah, but I have to make amends. I've heard that theme across the questions. Like, what do I do if I feel regretful? What do I do if I've made the wrong choices? Well, then you think about what's the next right action. So if you've yelled at somebody in your family and it really wasn't appropriate, or if there's a deep stress that's coming to the surface because of this proximity, this sort of constant stress and proximity, that probably needs to be addressed. You know, it might need to be addressed first with an apology, like I just realized how stressed I was and I lashed out and I'm sorry. But then it might bring, it might bring to light some other issues, which is like we have to work on how we deal with X in this situation, or I need to figure out how I can have 45 minutes alone sometimes because I genuinely need that to be able to be the kind of person I want to be in this relationship.
So let's flip that for a second. What happens if that person's on the other end and somebody lashes out at them and there's no acknowledgement by that individual that maybe that boundary was crossed? Mm. So how do you what do you do in that circumstance? Because you're saying, well, I need some self-compassion. That person needs some so what do you do in those consequences? Because we are in close quarters. That can happen as well. People just don't realize if they're dishing it out as opposed to being on the receiving end as opposed to dishing it out, so to speak.
And so we can be compassionate to ourselves, which is really what I'm advocating here. We can also be compassionate to the people that we're living with in these situations. And I think this is a complicated question, right? Because it really depends on the frequency of the difficulties.
Yeah.
It depends on the intensity of them. So if I snap at my husband, honestly, he's probably going to give me some grace because it's not that often. If I scream at my husband and call him a name, I probably don't deserve any grace in that situation. That's at least for me, an unacceptable line, right? And so I think these are really complicated questions, and they get to how are relationships functioning in quarantine, in the stress of quarantine.
Yeah.
And it goes back to like what I said earlier, which is if you are very self-compassionate, you're probably going to know in yourself what kind of behavior am I willing to tolerate, and then how do I skillfully address that in the relationship. I feel like it's a bigger question of like, how do you have a good relationship, which we should have another webinar on. I do think we can also extend some compassion and some kindness to the people that we're living with, as long as they haven't crossed one of those boundaries.
I think everybody's just feeling that stress of being with the same people all the time, family, whatever. It's just not what we've all expected what we'd be dealing with. So, so somebody wrote in, I require humor to cope, but so many people get upset when I joke to relieve tension. So how do I forgive them for not allowing me to exercise my best self-compassion? I think it's a great question. Humor is so important.
Humor is so important. It's interesting because I'd love to know more about the context. Like, I think that humor is such a great way to get through this. And if you can still maintain like some sense of being funny, like I've been in a couple of Zoom meetings lately where people just have the most ridiculous backgrounds, and it really does like lighten the mood if you can log on to your meeting and somebody's got the Tiger King like with their hair flapping in the background. Okay, so the question is, like, how do I forgive people for not letting me use humor in difficult situations?
Relieve my own self, so as part of my own self-compassion exercise, how do I forgive them for not allowing me to exercise my coping mechanisms, my self-compassion, because that's how I deal with the issues and the stresses.
I feel like I need to know more, because I think sometimes humor is so wonderful in dealing with situations, and it sounds like it's been a positive coping strategy.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's avoidance,
right.
And that can be, I'd really feel like I need to know a lot more because that's such a difficult line to walk.
Okay, so speaking of avoidance, another question about how do I know I'm not using self-compassion as a way to indulge myself and avoid reality?
Oh yeah, that's a great one. Okay. And that goes along with this idea that self-compassion is just self-pity, right?
Okay.
So I think we need to disentangle what being kind to yourself is from what being self-pitying is.
Yeah.
And so nobody, it's hard to be around people who are really like self-pitying, right? Who are like really avoiding their own reality and sort of like, oh, woe is me, I can't cope, in a really fake way. One of the things that we see with people who are more self-compassionate is that they do less of something called ruminating. And so rumination is like something bad happens or something is going to happen and you just sort of, chew it over and over and over and over and over again. And one of the things we see with people who are self-compassionate is they do less of that. They do less of that, like in your head over and over again kind of experience. And instead, I think they are more likely, well, I know that they're more likely to not ruminate and actually take action. So I don't see self-compassion as being self-pity or avoiding reality. I see it as giving people tools, a tool to cope with the distress that we all feel in our lives, and then to be able to like get on with things.
So that rumination characteristic is interesting. How do you break that cycle? Because a lot of that's a common trait in terms of how people go over things, and they're ruminating or they're catastrophically thinking or something like that. So, because the worst might happen. How does self-compassion sort of de-link the rumination?
Yeah. I have been studying mindfulness in my research, and there's a therapy. It's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and it was developed for people who have relapsing depression. So
Okay.
major depression, and one of the sort of key features of relapsing depression is rumination, and really like harsh self-talk, but also a lot of rumination. And this program, this mindfulness program, when people finish the 8 weeks, they seem to they're less likely to relapse from depression over time. And there's sort of two common mechanisms that have been identified as being helpful in this training of mindfulness. And the first is people recognizing that their thoughts are not facts. And as soon as we can get some space from a period of like excessive rumination, then if we can get this space and then realize like these are just thoughts, this is a thought I'm having. I could think I'm a pink elephant. I'm not a pink elephant. Why do I give any more credence to the fact that I think I'm worthless? Well, it's because it's an emotional thought. It feels more real, but it's not necessarily real. And then the second action, even though they don't teach self-compassion at all in this mindfulness program, the second thing that seems to be protective is people have more self-compassion at the end of it. The instructors say they model compassion. They're modeling being self-compassionate. And so I think disrupting those ruminative thoughts is really about recognizing like, this is just a thought that I'm having.
Right.
I'm having it over and over again. It's super painful, and so I think just acknowledging that pain allows you to really kind of dig into it, which is hard. It's scary. It hurts. It interrupts the process.
How can we help build self-compassion in our children?
Oh,
And at what ages does it sort of start to make sense, or is it something you start at a very young age and reinforce as they get older?
Yeah, I know we help reinforce self-compassion in our children for modeling self-compassion. I work with a woman, Dr. Leslie Roos at the University of Winnipeg, and she has this whole program of research on self-soothing as a way to interrupt transgenerational trauma. So she teaches parents how to soothe their own discomfort so that they don't pass on the maladaptive parenting that they experienced. And so I think if everything is modeling, right? Like I have a 3-year-old, anything I do, she does. And so if she sees me stub my toe and I go, oh, ouch, and then I sort of like am gentle with myself, that's how she's going to react. If she sees me stub my toe and I'm like, I can't swear on this, you know, all the expletives and, you know, kick the thing I stubbed my toe on, that's how she's going to react. And so, you know, if you need any more buy-in, if your kids see you do this, they're going to be so much more likely to respond to their own pain in this way.
Right.
I think also, let's say, you know, if your kid is sad, if they're ashamed, you want them to tell you probably. And the way that they're going to tell you is if they know you're going to respond compassionately, that you're going to their own experience.
Right.
Yeah.
What if somebody's asked a question, what if I always feel ashamed and always apologizing for everything, no matter how small?
I
know.
Yeah, I think if you always feel ashamed, yeah, I mean, first of all, that's a tremendously sad question. And I, you know, I think I wish we could see everybody's face in the whole webinar, because I think that if somebody asked that in a group, I can almost guarantee people would have had the same reaction I did, which was like, oh, I'm so sorry that you feel that way. I think if you're constantly feeling ashamed or struggling with, you know, feelings of self-worth, or like you have to apologize for existing in the space, that's probably the time to reach out to get some more professional help around that. And again, certainly I think self-compassion helps you make these decisions. I don't know that it's the panacea. Sometimes we need a group, or we need a trained therapist to help us sort of address these deep-seated difficulties.
What about if you're very self-critical relative to how others perceive you, and that you're always worrying about what other people are thinking, and you really would rather let that go? Or, you know, where does self-compassion intersect to help you just basically stop that cycle of being critical all the time of who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of criticism that you're talking about is really synonymous with this like dangerous trait called perfectionism. And to the extent that we are constantly striving to be perfect or act perfect, that's a very hard existence, right? And so if you think about this idea of common humanity, we are all imperfect. One of my favorite articles that's gone around in academia in the last couple of years was called a CV of failures, and it was this guy who just wrote out like every grant he didn't get, every paper that got rejected. And the reason I liked it because I saw myself in it, right? It was so humanizing. Yeah, and it was so much easier than like the normal, like only putting the grants you got up, only talking about the successes. And I think if you're really self-critical, then tapping into this like common humanity as well. Like we are all imperfect. First of all, nobody likes a perfect person. So let me release you from that. People are hard to connect with. It's very difficult to be around a perfect person. So I think that, you know, letting that go and just sort of allowing ourselves to have flaws is so humanizing and really allows you to connect with other people.
What about self-criticism as motivation? Because some people use that to motivate themselves. And maybe that's something worth speaking to as well.
Yeah, I mean, if it's working for you.
But does it become unconstructive or destructive or harmful? Where does that go?
I think, you know, if it's working for you and you like it, but if it's not, which is normally what I see, is that people have had this idea their whole life that they have to be unkind. And that's what's getting them the grades. That's what got them onto the collegiate basketball team. And they're afraid to sort of let it go. And then they do, and they realize, oh, that wasn't like my own skill got me here. You know, I didn't need, that was actually just more pain. I didn't need that to keep me motivated.
Well, we've got a few seconds left, so I really want to wrap up and say thank you for all your really valuable insight and support and ideas for all of us who are here on this webinar and who will be listening to it afterwards. It's definitely a tough time. And thank you for your thoughts today. Thank you everyone for being part of our webinar today. And we will have the resources again for you that you'll need if you want to follow up in the future. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you.